Welcome to another episode of the Ridgecrest podcast, where we take time out of each week. We're so busy here at Ridgecrest, but we want to give time to talk to you about last week's sermon. So it's going to be great. My name is Logan Elsie. I am stepping in as the host. It may not be for much more after that intro. Today we have Michael Estes once again.
Good intro.
Behind the mic. How's it going? Feeling good? Good. I'm very excited about that. So we are here because you started talking about Philemon. First of all, do you say Philemon or like Philemon or like?
I'm a Philemon man.
Okay. What's the other word? Philemon? There's another way that people say it.
I think the way I heard somebody pronounce it this week was Philemon.
There's no way that's
I'm
right.
not. British people do have some strange pronunciations.
So there's one thing that British people do that I want to incorporate into my own life, and it's not calling it like 1st and 2nd Corinthians. It's 1 Corinthians and 2 Corinthians.
I like when they say, instead of saying advertisement, they say advertisement.
Aluminium.
That one I can't get. That's too far.
Aluminium foil.
That's too hard to say.
I had a roommate for 3 years, 2 years or 3 years, that was British. He was from Wim, England.
Where is that?
It's right in central England. It's right, I can't remember where it's in. Shropshire.
Okay.
Shropshire, England, right smack in the middle. He was great. He lived here for a few years. It was a good time. And so,
nice.
Aluminium.
Oh, okay.
Anyway, so we're here to discuss how the sermon was. Some different things we want to talk about, some ways we want to go past the sermon, dive deeper into some thoughts that I had as I was listening to it. But first off, how did you feel about it?
I felt really good about it, actually. I was really nervous about week 1 just because I had never preached through one of Paul's greetings. I think I mentioned this in the sermon.
You never preached through one of Paul's letters?
One of his greetings.
Oh,
I had preached through some of his letters before, taught through some of his letters, but his greetings, typically you think to yourself, it's just his way of saying hello to everybody, and that's all he's doing there. But I really don't think that's the case in any of the letters. He's setting some groundwork up in a lot of cases, and that's what he did in this one. So I feel good about it. What about you? What did you think?
I thought it was terrible.
Okay. So that's the end of the podcast today, everyone. We're going to go eat lunch.
You'll see how I felt about. There's 3 of my questions that I think you'll be really happy to explain, or you'll be like, oh, Logan should never be the host again. So speaking of groundwork, why don't you just give a 30,000-foot overview of Philemon, just to give context for people, just in case they never listen again.
Okay.
They'll know what Philemon is.
Yeah, so Philemon is a letter that the Apostle Paul writes to a very specific individual, a guy named Philemon. And he is writing to address a very specific situation. Philemon had a runaway slave that had been living in his house. He was a household slave. His name is Onesimus, and he runs away from Philemon. And not only does he run away, but there is the insinuation that he has taken some of Philemon's stuff with him, some money or some possession, something that had to do with Philemon's material wealth. With him as he went. And while Onesimus is gone, he meets Paul and becomes a believer. And Paul wants to right this whole situation. He wants to bring about reconciliation in the situation. And he doesn't believe that it's right for him to hold on to Onesimus, even though he wants to, because Onesimus has been helping Paul while he's been imprisoned. And so he is writing to kind of address this broken relationship and try to bring about healing between Philemon and Onesimus.
I didn't ask you this question, so we'll just do this on air as we're talking.
Right, I like it.
When talking about Philemon, we always have to bring up the slavery thing in the context of that, because in some ways it's the same, and in a lot of ways it's very, very different from the way that we as Americans think of slavery in the West. Absolutely. You're obviously going to expound on that much more in a later date. Is it worth having like a 2-sentence explanation of Onesimus' slavery versus like an African slave or anything like that at this moment?
I think it's fine.
Okay.
Just 2 really quick points. One, Roman slavery was not based on ethnicity in any way, shape, or form. So there wasn't the idea that so-and-so is a superior person because they are of a particular race, and therefore the other person is dehumanized because they are not that race. That was not the foundation of Roman slavery. A lot of times, Roman slaves were people who voluntarily, basically indentured themselves. They became slaves so that they could learn a trade or pay off a debt or something along those lines. Roman slavery also had a very specific expiration date. And what I mean by that is typically Roman slaves were freed by the time they turned 30. They are completely emancipated, and typically they are set up to be able to do specific jobs as they come out of it because they have learned a trade while they were in slavery. And then the third thing that I would say, I said two, I think, to begin with, but I'll say three.
Because
I am
do what you want.
Making up stuff as I go.
Don't say that.
Not making up the answer to this question.
I'm just making junk up.
So, but the last thing is that I lost it now. That was good.
Basically, so far we're just it's very similar to indentured servitude.
Yeah, it is. And the last thing is that Roman slaves had rights. They had very specific rights laid out in Roman law, whereas in 19th century America, slaves had zero rights, zero freedoms. There was not the idea that you were ever going to be emancipated unless your master just decided that you would be. Right. And it was very clearly racially, like it was motivated, or not motivated, but like foundationally, it was a racist institution.
Right.
And so, like, those are the main differences between. It doesn't mean that I'm good with the fact that there were people that were property of other people, but right. That's part of the reason I think Paul doesn't try to just completely radically change the social structure in Philemon.
Right. So. Well, good. I want to go ahead and get into it with our first question. My first question is, how dare you make a sermon out of only 3 verses? How dare, and the greeting, no less.
Yep.
No comment to that?
I'm not really sure.
Not a question.
So it's more
when you say how dare you, that's not a question?
It's an accusation?
More of a statement.
Stephen says it's more of a statement.
Hold on a second. Is there a question mark at the end of it?
I put a question mark at the end because it says how. Grammar coach, help me. It says how dare you, like how dare you do this thing? It could be used as an exclamatory statement.
I think that's what it is.
I would say it's an exclamatory.
Can we hear you at all? Do I need to reiterate what you're saying?
I'm talking loud enough to where I'll probably come in.
Okay.
I mean, if you change the wording to how do you make a sermon out of 3 verses, then it's definitely a question.
Yeah.
And hopefully I demonstrated that on Sunday. Maybe I didn't.
Well, let's actually try to make this a serious question.
Okay.
You made it not just out of 3 verses, but you just did the greeting,
right?
Which historically, most people just read over. You
right.
glaze over to get to the quote good stuff. Mm-hmm. Why did you decide to make this a full sermon?
Part of it was because in this particular letter, Paul doesn't waste any words in here. He has put everything in here on. By the way, I would make the argument that he doesn't waste any words in any of Scripture because it's all Scripture. It's all right. Inspired by the Holy Spirit. But this isn't just a formality that he's going through. It is that, but it's more than that. It is. I'm going to begin to use some terminology and say some things that are going to make some connections theologically and. Mm-hmm. Like on a practical level. Mm-hmm. And so the fact that he brings up, or he calls himself a prisoner as opposed to an apostle
yep.
or a slave of Jesus Christ,
yep.
he is identifying himself with the weaker one in this particular situation, right. Onesimus. Onesimus could be imprisoned for what he did. I'm a prisoner. I want you to see that you need to be on the side of the prisoner here. Because Philemon would have a connection with Paul and be on Paul's side. And so he's rhetorically doing something that's really important there. That's part of the reason why I felt like as I look through this, the greeting would be important. And then also I wanted to make the point that like the greeting is important. In every one of Paul's letters, he doesn't just do it just to, hey, how you doing?
Right.
The same thing with the end of his letters. Like I know that a lot of times we read over that because of a bunch of people's names and that sort of thing. But it's important for us to understand that, like, Paul wasn't doing all this stuff by himself. He right. was intimately involved in a community of believers that was changing the world and doing things that would further the kingdom of God. And so I think it's important that we think about that and understand that too.
And I either watched a video or read a podcast about the act of like the biblical writers and they wrote how they wrote stuff, especially Paul. Like he would have a scribe in some cases who would write things down, but like paper was extremely expensive. It cost a lot of money to send letters across the known world at that point.
Yep.
And also he knew like he was writing to churches, and so he just took these opportunities to just slam pack different truths and theological things in there. That's why, especially Paul, a lot of his writings are so dense. It's because he was just always trying to make every word count.
Absolutely.
And some of his sentences, you could tell he's trying to throw like a paragraph into a sentence.
Yes. It's almost like he starts chasing rabbit trails as he's going like through a thought. He just keeps on going. He's like, well, and that also affects this and this and this. So yeah, definitely.
So is it safe to say that the majority of the sermon was a clear path from Philemon and his house church and that relationship to us and how we should be as the church today, as a community, how we react with one another, stuff like that. And so I want to know how I want to say this. The first part talked a lot about unity within the church. It talked about how the church is supposed to be one body, one team, one family. How would you rate / score us as far as unity within the church today? Or like, and then what is something we're doing well, and maybe where is a place where either the Big C Church or our specific community of Ridgecrest where we can miss the mark?
Yeah. The church as a whole, I'm going to use the Big C Church here, is not very unified right now. I think we could probably agree on that. I mean, we live in a culture that's not very unified in any way, shape, or so I think in some ways our church is a reflection. Again, our church being the Big C Church, not Ridgecrest Church, is a reflection of the culture, which is bad because we don't want to be a reflection. We want to be contrary to. We want to set ourselves apart from culture, and be culture changers, not people who conform to it. So I think in some ways we have conformed to culture, and as it's, we live in a place or a time where there's a lot of dissension. We see that within the Big C Church. So my rating would not be very high right now. That said, I do see pockets of there's some real discussion about, okay, what have we really identified ourselves with, and those things that we've identified ourselves with are those things that create unity or dissension within the church, and if they create dissension, then should they be things that we identify with? And I think it's going to come back to the things that, and this is where I think Ridgecrest does a good job. When we are most unified is when we have a common goal. We have a really clear mission where we are a part of a movement that is serving and loving well. Because that's one of the things we do really well as a church is I think we serve and love one another pretty well. We hear of a need within the church and we respond. And that's where you see unity really happen. And it's when we have those times where we have quit being focused on the needs of people around us and reaching people around us. We start kind of really focusing inwardly a lot. That's where we see that dissension kind of sneak in, and we lose track of the mission. We struggle.
Right.
So I would argue that Ridgecrest is a lot like a lot of other churches where there's a lot of room for growth in this area. But I do see us as a relatively healthy church when it comes to we love one another well, we serve one another well, and we do it because we believe that it's furthering the kingdom. And so that's a really great place to start and grow from, I think.
Yeah. And now what's interesting about the letter of Philemon is that Onesimus was outside of the church. So it was really, before Onesimus came to know Jesus, it was really just Philemon needs to take care of his own business. Not like take care of his own business, but like his affairs are his own. Now that Onesimus is within the body and within the flock, I think it's important that Paul is saying, like, okay, now this is an issue of the body. This is an issue of the family. Let me make a request of you, but also let me hopefully give some guidance to how to handle this matter within the body. I just think that's interesting about how, we should always, be fighting against darkness and being different from the world. But then there's also this part that I don't think we always think about a lot, is that there's a way that the body handles itself as the family of God. And that it shouldn't always make sense to the world. It should sometimes look a little crazy and a little weird. Not saying that this is crazy or weird of forgiving a slave, but it's just the way that the church is supposed to handle things is different.
Well, an example of what you mean as far as like the crazy, it would look strange to the world. Like Paul really lays out a case in 1 Corinthians that believers shouldn't sue one another. They shouldn't go to court against one another.
Right.
And that means that there are going to be times where we, as a person that's been wronged, are going to have to just be okay with being wronged and working through that with another believer. And whether they, fix that wrong or not, hopefully they will, because they're changed. The gospel encourages them to do that.
Right.
But even if they don't, there's a sense in which we kind of go like, I'm okay with that.
Yeah. Which further compounds a sub point that you made in the sermon, of that unity does not mean lack of conflict. It doesn't mean lack of disagreements or misunderstandings, but it's how we go about that. Because, as you always talk about with shalom does not mean absence of conflict or disruption.
Yeah.
It's just that there's contentment, there's a willingness to go back and forth, there's a family who is working together to have unity and to work things out.
Yep.
So speaking of unity, as a church, let's make it specific to our context.
Yeah.
For Ridgecrest, we are in some ways very diverse and in some ways not diverse. In some ways we are very unified, in some ways we are not unified. What's the opposite of unified? Disunified. There's a word for it, but I can't think of it.
That'll work.
And you talked about what was your first question? I can't remember off the top of my head. Your first point, that was the question.
With whom do we identify?
Yeah. And you talked about how we've got to learn to identify with people who are outside of our demographic or our socioeconomic level or whatever. So practically, as you're thinking through this, wherever you are on the middle class, lower class, upper class, ethnic, cultural, whatever line or bubble that you put yourself in, how do we as Ridgecrest, as the church, how do we seek to identify with people that are outside of that?
Yeah, I think it begins with, typically people who are inside of our bubble. I'll use the word bubble.
Bubble's probably a better thing to say.
Yeah. People who are inside our bubble, the thing that would characterize the beginning of a relationship is comfort. Like it's easy to enter into these relationships. It's because we have shared interests. Automatically, we have shared concerns. We have kind of shared histories. All those sorts of things kind of go together in that bubble. I think the way you can begin to do that is to start by okay, what are some relationships that if I started this relationship, this would make me a little uncomfortable. Like it would not be easy for me to enter into this relationship.
Right.
And not in a negative sort of way.
Give me an example. It doesn't have to be a personal example, but just make that picture clear. Like, what do you mean, like that? Knowing that person will make me uncomfortable.
Okay, so you can do this a bunch of different ways, but let's just use socioeconomic. So when I was growing up, I lived in Clinton, and very much like Madison in a lot of ways.
Right.
So my family would have been considered middle to upper middle class, and I rode the bus with kids that definitely did not fall into that category.
Right.
We didn't automatically have shared interests, but we created relationships, partially because they reached out to me and partially because I reached back, that weren't naturally super comfortable. And they were, some of them were of a different race. Some of them were, their families had different types of job situations, that sort of thing, different family structures, those sorts of things. But yet we were able to still build relationships to the point that we knew each other well. We were able to talk. Like we wouldn't just talk on the bus. We would see each other outside of school,
Right.
at school, and talk, or see each other in the community and talk, that sort of thing. So like, sports also kind of worked in this way for me. Is I was put into situations where there were people that I normally would not have spent time with, and like we spent time together and we became friends through that. And the relationship wasn't just a natural, like very comfortable relationship to begin with. It was something where it took time to get to know each other, learn each other's kind of language,
Right.
That sort of thing.
It just at the risk of being political, because everything is just so
Sure.
politically charged and all that stuff. No matter where you fall in that stuff, everyone can agree that we all have biases. We all have things that we feel, and we all are more comfortable in what we know. Whether that's people that look like us, whether that's the same level of money that we have, or just even like where you grew up, just the people in your neighborhood that you're just more comfortable with that. And so I think it can be difficult to try to identify and be comfortable around people that are in different bubbles than you, because you're used to your bubble. And I think we should all be able to agree that that is the case, because even if you take it out of America, like when you go to a different country, you are uncomfortable, especially if you go to for lack of a better term, first, second, third. If you move down that ladder and you go to a place where people don't look like you, they don't act like you, they don't speak like you, like that makes you very uncomfortable, and it's hard to identify with that culture because it's so different from yours.
Yeah.
And so that's the same context. You just make it a little bit smaller, and it's like, oh, well, this person who's in my church, they look different than me. They may act different than me. They may talk different than me, but we're all one family, one body.
Yes.
And we're supposed to find unity. It's just, I think we need to acknowledge that, like, hey, sometimes that's difficult, and sometimes we have it takes effort to do that.
Absolutely. And effort's the right word. This is not, I don't know where we got the idea that all relationships should be effortless, and as soon as they're hard, then we should bail on them and that sort of thing. I think that's part of the reason that marriage is struggling the way it is in our culture. Is as soon as it gets hard, we're done with this.
Right.
But relationships by their very nature are messy and difficult a lot of times, and require lots of work for them to be good. And so, yeah, I agree with you. Like, effort's the right word there. You're going to have to enter into some relationships that require work and effort, and that's probably where a lot of the discomfort comes from.
So if we can agree that the first step is just introducing yourself and just, being nice to that person or family, like what's a second step? Because I feel like sometimes we say, like, hey, I know everybody, we're friends, and really you're just acquaintances because you've introduced yourself, you know them. What's a good second step?
I think the further and further we can move into somebody else's world, the more steps we're taking toward that sort of relationship. So, like, a first step is like introducing yourself at church and having a comfortable conversation or semi-comfortable conversation at church, getting to know each other's names, that sort of thing. Next step is let's go to a neutral place and have lunch. And then after we have lunch together, I want to invite you over to my home. And then maybe the next step after that is they invite you over to their home, and you're in their situation.
Right.
And so, like, there's this escalation of deeper intimacy where you're inviting one another deeper into your lives. And so it's not like a surface level. We're in a neutral place, the church, which, I mean, we can ask questions about whether or not churches feel like completely neutral, because if churches are predominantly, one socioeconomic group, somebody who's outside of that might feel really uncomfortable coming into that. Ridgecrest is really good about, like, as far as dress goes. I think make people feel comfortable across the board.
Wearing whatever.
Yeah. Other churches, maybe not that way. And I've been to churches where it's, the dress is for a particular group, and if you don't fit into that group, you feel uncomfortable walking into that place. And so,
right.
But like the further we can move away from like neutral places to places that bring us deeper into somebody's life and kind of allow us to enter into those places a little bit more and more, that's where you start to really begin to build those deep relationships. And I'd be able to identify with each other better.
And what's the point of doing that? Like, why put in the effort? Why pursue unity as a church so strongly? Like why not just hang out with my people? Like these relationships are easy. I've known this guy since I was in second grade. Why do I need new friends? Why do I need to go out and put all this effort into meeting and really developing these relationships?
I think part of it is because Jesus has called us to that. His desire is that the church be unified. You look at his disciples, and they were a diverse group of people.
Right.
But beyond that, that's what the kingdom of God is going to look like. And the more and more comfortable we can get with this is what the kingdom of God is. And the kingdom of God looks different than the kingdom of this world. The kingdom of this world says basically, you stay with the folks that are your folks. Tribalism is a big deal right now. Like you're with your tribe and you're comfortable with your tribe, so you stay with your tribe. Jesus says your tribe's not what you think it is. Your tribe is my tribe, and my tribe is pretty diverse. Like it's really diverse. It's got people from all tongues, nations. I got that.
Tribes, tongues, nations.
It's in Revelation.
That book.
Look it up in chapter 5, 4 and 5. It's in there. But there are people from all over the world, all different languages, all different ethnicities, all different backgrounds, histories, political leanings, those sorts of things that fit into this weird melting pot that is the church. And it expresses something of the heart of God in doing it.
Yeah. I think it's great. Sometimes I think, I've heard people say, like, I don't need new friends. Like, I've got friends. I don't need new friends. And I think that it's not just like, it's not so selfish. It's like, hey, there's a purpose behind this. There's a purpose behind, as a church, we are called to do this. Like, there's a point that we're trying to make and get to and see.
Yeah.
So, moving on from that, there's one Bible thing. You mentioned it and you addressed it in your sermon, but I just think it's interesting. It's part of that. It's part of this thing of like, sometimes we just read the Bible, we don't ask really silly questions, and I think a lot of times God can really teach us some things through really like almost seemingly insignificant parts of Scripture. And so, why did Paul have to call this man out in front of his whole house church and do this publicly? Like, this is this man's own business, and he addressed him in front of everybody. Why would he do that?
Well, I think you kind of hit on it earlier. It had become an issue of the body, like big B body, the church.
You got a big B body.
The big C church. It had become an issue of the church, and not just between Philemon and Onesimus. And there was again, like when one part of the body is hurting, the rest of the body should hurt as well. And Paul knew that and really believed that. And as he believed that, he was like, okay, there needs to be a reconciliation between Onesimus and Philemon. It can't just stay here. And it doesn't just affect Philemon and Onesimus, because if Onesimus shows back up and Philemon throws him in jail, now the entire church is like, but he's a believer. And how does this affect us? How does, is it okay for us to throw other believers into prison, those sorts of things? And so there's a sense in which, like, there's a communal accountability that needs to happen and take place. And that's what's happening by Paul saying, hey, look, Philemon, and also the church in your house, you need to know this issue's here, and it needs to be addressed in this way. Here's some guidance, here's some wisdom from your spiritual father. This is the way you should handle this.
So are we as the church called to call people out publicly and air dirty laundry? What is the line between gossip and slander and biblical calling out?
Yeah, the word for biblical calling out, the old word for it, was church discipline, and it's not practiced very often anymore. Part of that's because we don't have structures in place to keep members accountable. And I think we always think about accountability in such negative terms. Like, we always think, well, that just means that I'm in trouble.
Right.
When in reality, accountability means that, like, there are standards that God has given us to live by, and we need others to help us. So, like, for me, I worked at 2 different schools that treated accountability very differently. Okay, I had one school where all of the accountability was about behavior and student behavior, and very little about, like, are your students growing academically, those sorts of things. And it became very frustrating because some of the things that I wanted to try didn't fit within like the behavioral accountability that was existing there and did not go well.
Right.
Well, then I moved to a different school where it was more along the lines of, hey, we have structures in place. Here's what we would like for you to do. Now, within this, we're going to give you freedom to kind of work through what this looks like in your classroom. And I was given freedom, but I still was checked on a regular basis. And it wasn't like we're never going to look after you. We're never going to see what's actually happening. You can just go do whatever you want. Because I've seen that form of accountability.
Yeah.
Yeah. And that never works out well. That's all based on personal maturity and responsibility, and some people can handle that, and some people
which is great if everyone has personal responsibility and is very mature.
Right. We're talking about like across the spectrum, from top to bottom, leadership to the youngest believer in a church.
Right.
We are all on different spectrums of maturity as believers, and even the most mature believers still need accountability structures in their life to say, hey, have you considered this, or have you thought about this thing that you're doing right now? Is it really wise? Is it really, spiritually good? Is it those sorts of things? And so going back to the original idea of church discipline, I believe that's something that the church desperately needs, because what it does is it helps us as a body to grow together. And I think a lot of times we have a tendency to focus a lot on our individual growth, but we miss out on the collective growth of a body of believers and see as a bunch of us are maturing individually, all of a sudden the body collectively is maturing and is healthier. And so like I've seen church discipline worked out. It was messy and uncomfortable, but ultimately it created expectations for the body collectively that were good.
And that's just, discomfort is such a great word for it. It just makes you feel uncomfortable, because churches are supposed to be, we show up and we hang out and we eat pizza and have a good time, and then it gets messy, and that's uncomfortable. And I feel like for a lot of us, either we just don't know about it, we don't know that is even an expectation biblically, or we're just like, I don't really want to fool with that. Let's just let them sit on the back corner, pretend they're not there, and it'll take care of itself, or they'll handle it in court, or, it is what it is.
Yeah. And this is not the only time Paul does this in his letters.
No.
1 Corinthians, he does it. He calls out someone for sexual immorality in that situation. In his letters to Timothy, which, by the way, Logan helped me. 1st and 2nd Peter was not a part of the Pauline Epistles. I don't know why I said that. My brain must have just slipped. And anyways,
check it out. Second service, the one that we streamed.
So 1st and 2nd Timothy are in the Pauline Epistles, and in there he calls out a couple of people for like abandoning the faith and like chasing after the world, and he's doing that so that people can like go to those people and say, you need to stop, like you're going in a direction that leads to destruction. Because and in every case, by the way, when he does that, it's for restoration. It's not for I'm going to condemn you. I'm trying to help you be restored.
Yeah, we're not kicking you out of the club. Right. Where is it where he talks about the steps to discipline? You go by yourself, you go with two brothers, you go with three, or whatever that
Matthew 18 is where that is. And it does kind of work through those steps. You have like, first you go as a believer to another believer and say, hey, I see this in your life. This is a problem. And then you take a group of leaders with you the second time if it doesn't stop and say, listen, we know this is going on. You need to stop. You need to change. And then after that, it goes before the church, the ecclesia, the assembly. And the time that I've seen this practiced really clearly, it was a Sunday night at our church in North Carolina. We were having Lord's Supper, and pastor got up and explained that we were barring a member from the table. And I was like, okay. And he explained the situation. He said one of our members became aware that he was in the middle of an adulterous affair, went to him and said, brother, I know this is going on. You need to stop. He assured him he would. he would return to his family. He did not. Then a group of leaders within the church went to this individual and said, you need to stop. You need to return to your family. What you're doing is sinful. And he did not stop. And at that point, our pastor felt like it was necessary to disbar him from, I guess that's the right word, from the table. Basically say you could not come to the table because we can't be united with you in your sin.
Yeah.
So, and it was very sobering. I think there were some people that didn't like the fact that he did that, but the truth of the matter is we are supposed to be a holy people, and that means that we at times need to make sure it's clear that we're separated from habitual, willful sin, where we're just like, I don't care, I'm going to do what I want to do.
Right.
So.
Which is very different than, hey, I made a mistake. I've asked for forgiveness.
Yes.
Please help me. Two completely different positions
Absolutely.
that we're talking about.
Yep.
I think we could and should do a much more detailed talk on church discipline.
Yeah.
Probably should move on from that part because that wasn't even a point of your thing. So let's give an example and walk through where we've been so far. So there's you and your family as church member, and there's another family that you want to get to know. They're different from you. You've heard the sermon. You're like, hey, these people are outside of my bubble. I want to have unity within the church. I want to make our church look like a slice of what heaven is going to look like. You greet them. You get to know them. Step 2, you go out to lunch. You befriend them. You're hanging out with them. You're doing great. And you move into what we call under the big umbrella of discipleship. And you move through that. And we talk ad nauseum about discipleship. We think it's vital. We think it's central to the way the church should operate. And we go into it. And I feel like very well-meaning church members and people who just want to follow God and want to disciple others, when they think of discipleship, they think of it so very formally. They think of it very like coffee shop-ish, of like, you bring your Bible, I'll bring my Bible, we're going to have a Bible study, which is fantastic.
Yeah.
Don't hear me say that's not fantastic.
There's a place for that in there.
There is so much more that is under that umbrella of discipleship. So within this context, let's say that you're trying to find unity and deal with people. You mentioned discipleship, but practically, what does that look like? Like, what is, besides you and the other guy, or you or like your wife and the other lady meeting for coffee to have a Bible study, what are ways that we can find unity through discipleship? Like, what are just some different ways that we can do that?
Well, I think a huge part of discipleship is just sharing life together. Like, and sometimes that will be a Bible study in a coffee shop, but there's going to be plenty of times where it's just going to be like our families are at the baseball field together, and we're going to spend the afternoon, being together, talking together, kind of, what's been going on in life, how are things going, how are your kids, those sorts of things. And then as you have those relationships, it should naturally spill out of us, like, you're struggling with this, I'm struggling with this, like, how do you think we should handle this as believers, like, together? How do you think we should handle this issue with our kid?
Yeah.
Or this issue in life? How do you think we should handle our finances? Those sorts of things. Because as you befriend people and you get deeper into relationship with people, those conversations happen naturally, and it's not something where it's this forced thing where, like, we had a Bible study about how to raise a family. No, you just spent time together and you watched your families grow up together, and you saw that their kid was going through this, or your kid was going through this, and you need a dad's perspective. You need a dad's perspective, and so you go to another dad and you're like, hey, my kid's going through this right now. Has your kid ever gone through anything like this? How did you handle it as a father who is a believer? Like, what did you do? Mm-hmm. And that's a much more like a day-to-day kind of, this is what discipleship, how it happens on a day-to-day basis. A huge part of it is being intentional. Don't get me wrong. Like, you've got to be like, I'm going to seek this person out on a regular basis, and I want this to be a relationship that I build and pour into and that sort of thing. Jesus didn't just haphazardly teach people. He picked out 12. He said, these are going to be the ones. I'm going to pour into them more than I pour into anybody else. And there were times where he poured into more. There were times where there were 72 or 70, and there was times where there were thousands. But like, day by day by day, he walked with those 12. And I'm sure there were plenty of times where they were like, "Hey, help us understand this part of the Old Testament." They didn't say Old Testament, but
the law.
the law. But there were plenty of times where they were probably just talking about life, and they saw somebody doing something, and they were like, "What do you think about that?" Mm-hmm. And it was opportunities, just kind of on a day-to-day practical basis. And for us, it looks like, "Hey, I was thinking about this today. I'm gonna shoot a text message to my friend and see what they think about this." And that friend then has a chance to speak into their life in a way that's biblical. It's Christian, and that's kind of the way I think discipleship should look.
So how do I seek and seize opportunities versus just waiting for something to show up? Like if I'm just waiting for him to text me and say like, "Hey, I'm really struggling with blah blah blah. Please share Jesus with me."
Yeah, you don't wait till they're struggling. So it becomes this thing where like, one, I know you well enough to know if you're struggling, or so like it gets rid of that superficiality that we have a tendency to live in relationships. So I'm intentionally like, I want to know you well enough to know that things are good in your life or things are difficult in your life right now, whether you're growing or whether you're not. And then there's the next step of, okay, I'm going to seek out and find out from you how you are. So it's a phone call, it's a text message, I'm going to stop you in the hall at church. All right, well, let's go out to lunch. I just want to hear how you are right now. What's going on in your life? Like, talk to me about those sorts of things. And the more you do that, the more you show that you can be trusted with that. And there's no, like, you're not asking that from a judgmental standpoint. It's more like, I care about you. I want to find out, if there are ways that I can help you, or maybe there are ways that you can help me. I think in most cases, there's going to be a person that is spiritually mature that's going to be able to pour into a life that a person that is either spiritually immature or spiritually struggling.
Right.
And I think the onus is on the one that's spiritually mature.
The what?
The onus.
What is an onus?
That means the burden.
Made me think of the word opus.
Yeah.
Like what's that movie? Magnum's Opus or Magnum?
Something like that.
Steven, what is that movie?
Magnum opus.
Magnum Opus.
Yeah, that's like your greatest work.
I completely just shut everything that you were saying down. Your train of thought has left the station.
So that happens on a regular basis. It's a burden.
Yeah.
And so the burden's on the person that's spiritually mature to be the one that regularly seeks out that relationship.
I think for a lot of people, it's both way easier to disciple people than you think, and at the other point, way harder. Because in a sense, like, you do not have to be biblically, or not biblically trained. You do need to be that. But like, you don't need to be like a seminary trained theologian. No. You don't need to like have Greek stuff memorized. And like, you don't need to be prepared to do a weekly Bible study with 4 different people.
That's right.
Like, find people that you that are in your circle that you're doing life with. And then also, because what we're talking about, a few select families that you want to really reach out and really focus on and have as a part of your life and bring into your circle, and you enter their circle, have those people, and then just live with them.
Yep.
Like, love on them. And so in a sense, it's way easier than you think. In another sense, it's way more difficult than you think, because you have to live life with them.
It's commitment.
Yeah, which we're terrible at and we're terrified of. It's like, as a family, whether you're single, married, or with kids, whatever, like, we are going to meet together once a month. We're going to meet together. For some people, it's once every week or 2 weeks. Mm-hmm. Like, we're going to get coffee, or we're going to hang out, or kids are going to have play dates, and like, we're going to do life together, which can be awkward at first, especially with people that are outside of your circle, because it involves conversations. It involves not making sure, but lining up in certain things and figuring out where differences in cultures and things lie. And that's uncomfortable and awkward sometimes. Yeah. And so in some senses, it's way more difficult, but it's because it's like, hey, I'm going to be a part of your life, and you're going to be a part of my life for the next 2 decades. Instead of, we're going to do a 6-week Bible study and then I'll see you on Sunday. Yeah. And so
there's a place for that too. It's just,
right.
We're talking about the day-to-day discipleship. And,
and for our type A CEOs, you can't do this with everybody.
No.
The church is not meant for you to be Jesus, for lack of a better word, to everybody within our church. Maybe you could do that if you have a 25-member church or like a Bible study, but like with a church of any size, and I'm not just saying our church is a giant church, like 150-member church, you cannot do that.
That's right.
And so I think sometimes we just kind of we don't completely understand, or just we don't have the permission to let discipleship be, let's live life. And your life should already reflect Christ. So your discipleship is really just you letting Christ shine over you into the people around you.
That's right. Great question.
Glasses of grace. I've never heard that before. Yeah. What is it? Why is that important?
Okay. So for those who haven't heard the sermon, basically toward the end, I kind of talked about being able to see people in the right light. And I talked about the fact that, like, before I got my glasses, I couldn't see. I mean, they were just...
You and me are also both blind as bats.
Totally, 100%. 4.75, I think. In
my contacts are 550 on the right, 425 on the left.
Okay, so we balance out. We average out to be close to the same.
Yep.
It's bad. My children inherited this. Julie also has. So, like, but before I learned that about myself, like, everything was just kind of fuzzy, not really clear. And then I put glasses on for the first time. And I was like, oh, okay, that was a leaf on a tree that was green. That's nice to know. So in the same way, I believe that's kind of what happens to us as we become believers. We get these glasses of grace, this ability to see people, because the context of this was our relationships are founded on or grounded in grace. And so being able to see people with grace in mind, understanding, hey, they're sinners. Like, I should expect them to screw up, and to give them freely grace for those moments. That doesn't mean that we're just like fine. We talked about church discipline already. Doesn't mean that we're just fine with the fact that they're sinning, but we should always be willing to forgive. We should always be seeking their good as much as we possibly can. And so, like, being able to see people properly is what I meant by glasses of grace. And so, like, to see people with the grace that God gives us, I mean, the fact that I have been forgiven and I know what I've been forgiven for and all the things that I do on a regular basis, it really helps me understand the things I should expect from other people. I shouldn't be running around expecting people to be spiritually mature and be able to, handle every situation perfectly, and to be emotionally intelligent, and all these different things that we think of as important. I should expect them to be selfish and sinful, and not be surprised when they act in that way. It doesn't mean that I'm okay with it. It just means that I'm able to see them clearly and understand that they're not Jesus. I'm not Jesus. Jesus is Jesus, and I need to let him be that, and I need to give grace to those who can't do that.
Next week, we're going to talk about contacts of righteousness. And
there you go.
I tried to think of a C word off the fly. I couldn't think of one. Continuity. Consecration. Contacts of consecration.
There you go.
Got it.
Being able to see those things as sacred. There you go.
So, last question, and then I'll ask you a last-minute question that I'm still thinking through it right now.
Okay.
You talk about forgiveness, grace, the glasses of grace. We have such tremendous forgiveness, like life-altering, changing forgiveness from Jesus, and then we are supposed to, out of the overflow of that, forgive others. But we're raised in a subculture of deep South niceness. Of you say sorry, you apologize because it's the nice thing to do. And it's gotten to the point where you just say it almost. And sometimes you mean it. Sometimes I would say you don't mean it. And so someone has wronged you. They even said they're sorry when it happened, yet you still feel that. Or even other side of, like, you're trying to forgive someone for something they've done to you. How do we truly forgive someone, and what does that look like? Maybe just step one of that, of forgiveness. What is true forgiveness?
I think it's important for us to get rid of this idea of forgiving and forgetting, because nowhere in Scripture do I see God forgetting our sinfulness. What I see him doing is choosing not to remember that anymore. There's a difference between forgetting something and choosing not to remember that. What I mean by that is, and this goes back to the glasses of grace kind of idea, I know what you did, and yet I'm going to overlook that and see you in a different light. I'm going to choose to not let that thing that you did to me be the thing that dictates how I treat you and care for you and love you. And I think a lot of times when we begin to start talking about forgiveness, we think, well, I still remember what they did.
Right.
So I carry around some of those feelings still. But it's the active choice to say, I'm not going to judge you based on what you did. I'm going to see you in the light of, I want to forgive you. I want to let this go to the point that, like, I'm not going to hold it against you anymore.
Right.
Even though I know what you did, I'm not going to hold it against you anymore. And you don't hold it over their head and say every single time they screw up, well, you did this once. So, like, just remember that. I am choosing not to remember those things anymore.
Yeah. And that's not just like we good? We good. All right, let's move on.
That's right.
Sometimes, but there comes a level that happens pretty quickly where that's just not doable.
That's right.
There's been scars, there's been wounds, and it's just you don't what's the word? You don't stay in that place.
Yeah.
You see through the hurt. You don't just wipe it away and act like it wasn't there. You just kind of see through that hurt and say, I see you as you are underneath. I forgive you through that.
Yeah.
Man, we got into it.
That's right.
Church discipline, forgiveness, discipleship.
Grace, context of consecration, all of it.
Fantastic. So whenever I get to be the host and I'm landing the plane, I always take it upon myself to ask you, I try to ask you as random of a question as I can.
Okay.
So you don't have this question. You're not prepared for this.
That's right. This is that number. So y'all don't know this, but Logan sent me a list of questions. They were numbered, and there was number 8, and there was nothing after it. This is number 8.
Oh, it sure is. Number 8. If you and your family could go on vacation with any, there's so many different options, with any dead person. I'll make it so broad. With any person who's died, it can be famous, it can be insignificant. Not that someone's insignificant, but, like, you know what I mean by that. Famous, not famous, someone who has passed away.
Oh my gosh.
You could go on a vacation. Who would it be, and where would you go?
Okay, the where would you go part's a little bit easier for me. It'd be Ireland. I want to go to Ireland.
Oh,
really
okay.
bad. Who would it be?
I can funnel it down if I need to.
No, I mean, there's a famous Irish person that I really want to meet and talk to.
St. Patrick.
C.S. Lewis.
St. Patrick.
But St. Patrick's, he's not Irish, first of all. And there's some weird stuff going on there. Great guy. Spread the gospel all over Ireland, but not Irish. I would want to go on vacation with C.S. Lewis. He liked to hike a lot, and I'm kind of into that.
I knew he liked to, like, walk around his garden barefoot. Does that count as hiking, or he actually liked?
No, he went on walking tours all the time.
Oh.
He'd just go walking.
You think you could keep up with him?
Probably not at first. It would take me a couple of days to get kind of in shape.
I'm not gonna lie to you. I've never, like, looked in my mind's eye of C.S. Lewis and thought, like, shredded mountain hiker man, and that's kind of what I'm picturing now.
Yeah.
And
So,
it's very different.
I'm telling you right now, he never drove a car unless he had to. But where he lived in Oxford, I've been to the place where he lived, and he would walk to campus. Now, he had a room on campus where he would stay on his campus, but it is a very long walk. We're talking about hours long walk from where he lived to where he would teach. And he would do this on a semi-regular basis. And so, yeah, he walked a lot.
So I feel like all the questions I ask you, the answer is always C.S. Lewis.
It's such an easy way out for me. Now, if you were to ask the rest of my family, like, I'm pretty sure Michael would want to go with a famous president of some sort.
I almost said dead president.
Yeah.
I almost said that.
He probably would choose one of the presidents. I don't know which one he would choose. Jackson would probably...
Mickey Mantle. Does he care at all about old baseball players?
Not a lot. Not as much as you would think. As being a kid who likes baseball as much as he does, I don't think so much. He would choose somebody that, like, socially was pretty important. He kind of has, like, a thing about that kind of thing. Lorelai would be an author. I don't know of any dead authors that she would be super interested in.
Yeah, she would be a living young adult fiction.
For sure. There's a series of books called Warriors. They're little cat books.
Did I tell you I read the first one?
Did you really?
Yep.
Did you like it?
It was very young adult fiction.
That's right.
But the writing was good.
Yeah, she really likes that particular person. She's actually written to an author before and gotten a response.
Really?
Yep.
They're just normal people.
Oh, yeah.
They're just nerds who grew up and some of them found success and made money.
Yep. So,
Julie.
I think she may pick a family member.
Oh, that's another way to take it.
Like
great-grandmother?
She had a great relationship with Julie's mom's mom. So her grandmother.
Yeah, maternal grandmother.
Yes. Had a great relationship with her, and she misses her a good bit. And so I wouldn't be surprised if she picked her.
The reason why I thought of that question was last night me and Megan were talking, and I said, out of current or former staff members that we've worked with, who would you want to go on vacation with and why? And when I was thinking about asking you that question, I don't think I could have handled the response, and so I changed the last part. Because if it's not us, I just don't know what we'd say. It would just hurt my feelings too much. Well, that was good. Anyway, we're glad that you joined us for this very long episode of the Ridgecrest podcast. When I host, there are no timetables. We go all the way till the speaking is done. So if you have any questions, you can like this, you can post a comment, you can send an email of all your concerns to Jenna Craig, that's gcraig@ridgecrest.net.
Yeah.
But really just negative things. If it's positive, you can throw it our way.
Yeah.
Other than that, we will see you next week. Any announcements that I need to make, Stephen, producer?
No.
Don't forget that we do have Night of Worship for students and lots of other summer activities if you're watching this post when it's posted. Just know that student ministry is happening. There's lots of stuff going on. Go to ridgecrest.net students for more information. Other than that, we'll see you next time.